continuing our discussion of factoring trinomials. Last time we looked at factoring trinomials whose leading coefficient is 1. This time we want to look at another subcategory of trinomials, and these are called perfect square trinomials. Now, some perfect square trinomials also have a leading coefficient of 1, so they kind of fit two categories. You can factor them from either perspective. But perfect square trinomials are also easy to factor. They're just not always the first thing on students' minds. And we forget sometimes how to recognize that we have a perfect square trinomial. For example, 4x squared plus 4x plus 1 is a perfect square trinomial. But 4x squared plus 2x plus 1 is not. Also, 4x squared minus 4x plus 1 is also a perfect square trinomial. So these two are perfect square trinomials. This one is not. Well, how do I tell the difference? Well, here's what you look for to know that you have a perfect square trinomial. The first and last terms must be perfect squares. Now, don't forget that 1 is a perfect square. The square root of 1 is 1. All right? So 1 is a perfect square, and 4x squared is a perfect square. The square root of 4x squared is 2x. 2x times 2x equals 4x squared. So these are both perfect squares. And you see each one of these trinomials has those terms. But the middle term is what's key. The middle term needs to be 2 times the square root of your first term. In this case, it's 2x. Times the square root of the last term. If the middle term equals 2 times the square root of the first term times the square root of the last term, you have a perfect square trinomial. And this one does. 2 times 2x times 1 is 4x. So it's a perfect square trinomial. Now notice that that middle term can be either positive or negative. All right, so let's factor 4x squared plus 4x plus 1 as a perfect square trinomial. Those are very easy to factor. Once you recognize that that's what you have, because the factors, first of all, are identical. Now I'm going to write them out. Even though they're both going to be exactly the same, I'm going to go ahead and write them out. And they are going to have the square root of the first term as their first member, and the square root of the last term as their last member. So the square root of 4x squared is 2x, and the square root of 1 is 1. And they're going to have the same sign as the middle term. So this one factors to 2x plus 1 times 2x plus 1. You could write it this way, 2x plus 1 squared, because you have 2 of them. Let's factor another one. Here's a real common one, x squared minus 6x plus 9. This is a perfect square trinomial. The square root of the first term is x. The square root of the last term is 3. And if I multiply x times 3 and multiply them times 2, then I should get the middle term. And sure enough, 2 times x times 3 is 6x. That's my middle term. So remember that when I factor it, my factors are going to be identical, so I really only have to write it once and put a squared out here because they're both the same. And the first term of my factor is going to be the square root of the first term, which is x. The last term of my factor is going to be the square root of the last term, which is 3. And it gets the sign of the middle term, x minus 3. So this is x minus 3 times x minus 3. Now let's do one more. This one's going to be a little bit tricky. (16x squared minus 80x plus 100). All right. Now, this is a perfect square trinomial because 16 is a perfect square, x squared is a perfect square, 100 is a perfect square. And the square root of 16x squared is 4x. The square root of 100 is 10. And if I multiply 4 times x times 10 times 2, then I get 80. So it is a perfect square trinomial. But don't forget step 1. Look at step 1. Take out the greatest common factor. I have a greatest common factor in this trinomial, and I really should take it out first. If I don't, then the answer I get will still be correct, but it won't be complete. Those factors will not be prime. In order for me to get all prime answers, to completely factor my trinomial, I have to do step 1 first. So I'm going to take out the greatest common factor. Well, the largest thing that I can take out of all of those, the factor they have in common is 4. So I'm going to take a 4 out. And when I take 4 out, then I have 4x squared minus 20x plus 25. If the original was a perfect square trinomial, so is this one. So I'm going to factor it like a perfect square trinomial. Now I have my 4 on the outside. He doesn't go away. And then my factors, of course, are identical, so I can put my squared up here. And they consist of the square root of the first term, which is 2x, and the square root of the last term, which is 5. And then I put a minus sign between them because the middle term is negative. And I have factored my perfect square trinomial.